So why don't you tell everyone out there about the amazing book that you wrote that's one of a kind and that no one knows anything about?
Well, I hope that many people will know a lot about it soon. It's called Raising the Bar, the Mentor Guidebook for New Lawyers. And it's going to be published by Routledge on December 2nd of this year. And the reason I wrote this book was it had become obvious to me that the way I was trained as a lawyer, which was, I felt, a very valuable kind of training, which basically was hands-on mentorship from senior lawyers who, for example, we would ride in the car down to Norfolk to see a client. And as a new lawyer, the partner would be telling me about the case in the car, about the law, what I needed to be looking for, what I needed to be thinking about, what the client was like. We'd get down to the client's place. I'd keep my mouth shut. I'd watch. I'd listen. I'd be in all the meetings. And then we'd ride back. And the partner would tell me, okay, here's the legal research that needs to be done. Here's the facts we don't know. Here's what we need to know about the other side and what they're up to. Basically, I'd get my assignment on the way back. That doesn't happen anymore. What's happened is that clients are not letting law firms put more than one lawyer on big pieces of cases. They're trying to shrink the amount of lawyers that work on their case, which means that the young lawyers aren't learning the way we did when we started. They're in the back room working on Westlaw and Lexis and, processing document requests with AI, digital tools, all that stuff. It's great. They are master researchers. They can compile documents. They can file wonderful things in court. But what they aren't learning is they're not learning about clients and not learning about how to build cases. And they're not learning those practical things. So what I tried to do in this book, talk about really simple things. How you build your career. What are the basic skills you have to have? What is an effective way to do legal research? How to deal with clients. That is a really important one. And understanding for the new lawyer, your partner is your client. And you've got to treat them like your client. And how to listen, how to hear what the assignment really is and what it really isn't. And fixing mistakes. And I've got a whole chapter, which I just love the idea, office politics. I guarantee you there's no law school course on office politics. At least I haven't found one.
Let's tell the story. Thank you for writing this book. So one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show first is just first off for my tremendous respect for you, the fact that I've always appreciated the fact that you dealt with the human aspect of this. I can remember JB telling a story back in law school as he was teaching negotiations that you were negotiating some issue. The woman had been there for 32 years, something like that, and had been let go. And you were representing the employer, and a mysterious bouquet of flowers thanking her for all of her years of service.
That's right.
Was sent with a wonderful book. Yeah. I've got a similar story. I had a client that had a falling out with a partner, and the partner, there might have been potentially some criminal aspects of things and definitely some money missing aspects of things and caused the business to go under. And there's still at the time of this event, there was still some things that were up in the air about what was going to happen. And so the client got a 1:32 a.m. email from the estranged office partner. You can imagine what that email looks like.
I can imagine what it looks like, yes.
Definitely seemed like there might have been some altered state of mind.
Might be. Drugs or
alcohol involved. And I mean, it was just, it started out with all caps. So let's just get straight to the point, Right. And then it was numbered bullets about how my client was the worst person in the world, and my client actually came to the office and shared it with me, and I had done such a good job of getting them to recognize when they get out of and then not react from that. So they came in, they said I didn't respond. So we drafted it in my office at the time, and I think it was all of 5, maybe 4 sentences long.
That's right.
And it was not dismissive. It was accepting without accepting responsibility.
Right.
It recognized the emotional state and that the other person had every reason to be upset.
Right.
Without taking responsibility, of course.
Right.
You know, because I think people recognize that in that circumstance, people aren't going to take responsibility.
They're not.
Other lawyers that were present in the room told my client, F this other guy. You don't need to worry about that. You know, who cares if he's upset? Yeah. Fuck him. Yeah. And so when they left and the client looked at me and said, well, Charlie, what do you think we ought to do since we're not going to do anything? I said, no, we're going to do something about that email. So we drafted the one I sent. Yeah. And because the next day I was going to be talking to the other client's lawyer. Can I tell you that the other client's lawyer told me specifically, as soon as we got on, he said, good job on that email response, Mr. H.
Wonderful.
And I said, what do you mean? He said, my client was so impressed with your client's response, he believed that someone else must have written it for him. And I guess the other lawyer and I knew each other, but hadn't worked. But he said that he said Mr. Inch, he wasn't surprised that a client of Mr. Inch's handled the case that way as opposed to the other way. You know,
isn't that wonderful?
And I will tell you what, it made all the difference.
Yeah.
You know, because really these people ought, even though they don't like each other,
yeah.
You know, when you have a partnership with something, like tearing that relationship down even if someone did something that was untoward,
right?
Even if everyone, all the justification to be angry. Mm-hmm. However, you know, when you're talking about litigation against it, it's, you know, now you have you break that foundation of being able to actually resolve the problem, and now we're, you know, throwing nuclear warheads at each other, and it makes it impossible.
But that's why our tradition in Virginia, and especially at the Richmond bar, is the civility among lawyers is so important.
Well, let's talk about that. I think we talked about it on the phone. What happened to that?
Well, there was a time when all the lawyers in town knew each other, so you couldn't afford not to be civil.
So because we're not kind of like a small town, country town anymore, is that the only thing?
Well, it's not. It's a little more complex than that. I'll tell you, for example.
And I mean no dismissal.
In the last 10 years, or maybe 20 years, we've seen the membership of the Richmond Bar Association, that's our local bar, shrink. And there's been a huge cost to that shrinking, because the lawyers don't know each other. And if you're having lunch with the other lawyers at least once a month, which we used to have a monthly luncheon, if you're having lunch with other lawyers once a month, you're telling stories, you're saying how wonderful your practice is going, you're doing all the stuff that, you know, we try to fool each other with. But it builds a civility and a decency and a cordiality that when we represent clients that just hate each other, like if you and I were on opposite sides of a case, Charlie, you and I can talk to each other. I don't hate your client the way my client hates your client. You know, that's a very valuable quality in a culture, is to have, and it's part of the lawyer's identity, to be the person that can rationally.
See, I think we've gone away from that identity. We've gone to the identity of like that thing must be said because it's true.
Right.
And, some of the domestic relations.
The
lawyers,
gunslinger
there's
mentality.
A couple. Well, I mean, I consider myself a gunslinger as well. However, you know, the way I think about it is consciousness. If you're going to get into a night, if you can be of conscious mind, it doesn't mean that you always have to be a monk. It means if you get into a fucking knife fight, you don't need to stab everyone in the room.
No, you don't.
You know,
just need to stab the right person.
Stab the right person, or use the knife to keep your people from getting hurt. You don't need to use it excessively. And it seems that we almost justify that we are an adversarial profession as to actually make it even worse. You know. And I liked what you talked about keeping your eye on the ball, about solving the problems in the cases, because I think we end up getting into that. We end up getting into this kind of cage fight mentality.
Yes.
And I see this in the public defender's offices a lot, you know, and I don't know if it's the offices. I don't know if it's because we're dealing with indigent, and we're dealing with really we're just so spread thin. I don't do a whole lot of the indigent defense anymore, but I see this stuff going on in the courts when I'm going through the courtrooms and in the courthouses. And so there's kind of an attack often, but you get that also in the prosecutors as well, that there's just like lack of humanity, and there's also a lot of blame, shame, and judgment language.
Right.
Like I've actually had prosecutors say, Charlie, your client's a piece of shit. And I'm like, well, I don't know them well enough to say that.
That's way a line for a prosecutor to say. They can say, I believe your client committed very serious crimes because here's exactly what he did.
Right.
But his status as a human being is not the prosecutor's job to.
Well, these are probably prosecutors that feel safe enough to share that with me. And I'm not going to give any names, so I wouldn't ever.
Right.
I'm just saying that's like we have a blame, shame, and judgment culture.
Right.
And I'm seeing it the likes. There's a guy named Dan Carlin has a hardcore history podcast. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it or any of the listeners, but Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, one of the series was called Supernova in the East. But it talked about how did the Japanese Imperial Empire end up as an Axis power in World War II after having been one of the Allied powers and were probably, considerably successful in World War I with very few losses because Japan did very little in World War I.
Right.
But they gained Manchuria, they gained all sorts of other
gained
stuff.
a lot of ground.
But there's a connection between it, that the shame culture of that kind of pre-World War II aspect. I mean, Naval Academy cadets were walking into admirals' offices and killing them because they didn't believe that they were national Japanese, like that they were Japanese national enough. I mean, just the shame, and it like there's really
shame.
And even like people like CEOs of businesses were being assassinated in public for being not being seen as pro-Japanese enough.
There are a lot of lawyers just being shamed for who they are.
Right.
And there are lawyers feeling that they're more important because of who they are.
Right. Right.
And we're not treating each other as just regular human beings.
The same thing that seems to be happening to our culture is happening to every aspect of our culture. Ken Wilber talks about integral theory, but he's got a couple of diagrams, so within, so without, but then so within plural, so without plural. But it's like, as it seems we're having a really bad issue with shame, blame, and judgment right now. I mean, I would tell you there may have been some people that wanted to hurt a bunch of people that have come through my office over the past 2 years. I had one particular guy, I don't know if you call it mass shooter intervention. I don't want to necessarily go that high, but we lawyers deal with people when they're in tremendous crisis.
We meet them at their worst times.
Tremendous
of life.
Crisis.
Yes.
Right. And so you have these conversations, and we've got, there's a whole bunch of aspects to all of this. But the guy looked at me once I said something about one of my experiences personally. He just said, Inch, I can't believe you just said that. He said, he said, I can't. And he admitted that he was thinking about doing something really awful the next day to a group of people. And then he messaged me for the next month saying how happy he was that he and I talked.
Isn't that great?
And then, right. But it was just, these are the kinds of experiences that I've now started to have. Let's talk about who I was in law school, right? And so, like, this is tremendously, I don't want to say humiliating. It's certainly embarrassing. I even up until a couple of years ago was tremendously reactive. I've dealt with a lot of adversity in my life that I think a lot of other people don't necessarily think of. But I'm short. My last name is Inch. There's a lot of things that I've had to struggle with, and it's interesting. Even now, I walk into rooms, and as soon as people see me stand up front and say my name is Inch, everyone has a chuckle because I'm short. It's like every room I've walked into, I get laughed at.
You should sing your name then, and they would see what a great singer you are.
Well, there's lots of things I do well. The problem is that no one cares about those things at first. The first thing you get noticed about is all this, and then everyone thinks that they've got the first joke, right? So, and that's not, and I don't want to make that justification. My theory is that we are a human, we are a mortal social being.
Right.
Which means that a mortal social being must learn two things: how to fear physical harm or death, and how to fear being carved away from a social order by abandonment or exile. And so really everything comes back to what are those two fears, how do they show up? And then once you start seeing things from that paradigm, then now you can see how that's the connection then to the neurological system, because all of that blames, what we stopped hitting the kids. I don't know. Do you remember when did it become? You're older than I am.
Sure.
When did they say stop hitting the kids?
Wow, that was sometime, I think, in the 70s.
So when they said stop hitting the
Both
kids,
my children were born in the early 70s or mid 70s.
what was the answer when say, okay, you can't hit them? Now what do you do to them?
Oh, it was timeouts. It was
Timeout.
Exile from the community.
Exile for go over there and get in that corner for however long. And that's what I'm saying is we're surprised that, and I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm seeing men talk when they sit in this room in those chairs over there, and you give them a safety word and say, hey, when this starts to get a little uncomfortable, or if you feel like I'm prying a little too deep, then mango. Mango. It's like a parachute ripcord. Yeah. And I said, and if I seem to get defensive and say, oh my goodness, why did that hurt you? I said, if I do that, then just mango again, because I'm not intending to hurt you anymore. Yeah. You know, but giving people the off switch, because when has someone done that for us? You know? Well, as soon as we tell someone,
not in my life.
I'm not really comfortable talking about this. What do they say next? Well, then apparently we need to talk about it right now. Yeah. It's like, well, I'm already not safe. Right. You know? Okay, so you care about you talking, but you don't care about the consequence.
Right. But that's cultural, Charlie. There are, we've been talking about the whole conversation has been. There's been a lot of talk about safe spaces for women in our culture. Okay, when's the last time you heard somebody talk about a safe space for a man?
None. And men are, and you know the thing, men are also causing their own problems as well, because we pride ourselves on being the provider,
right? And
then are upset that people only hold us to be a provider once we're out of their life.
Because
because we have an inability to touch our vulnerable emotions.
Exactly.
Because I think it's the blame. If you show the vulnerability, then that becomes a reason to be exiled. Yeah. And so my theory is that in order to not show it, you can't feel it. Yeah. So therefore, instead of feeling vulnerable emotions like loss and grief and the experience of tremendous, not guilt, but it's like connection to someone that commits suicide for someone that came to you for help recently.
Or burden of other situations that just compounded.
Right. Everyone that abandoned us later on, even if it's a year or anything else later, points back to that thing. I've got 2 friends that abandoned me at the end of last year, and I was kind of at a really deep. My friend Sharon was sick; she ended up dying at the beginning of, and so I was just in a tremendously difficult place, and I ran into them recently, and don't you that they kind of like Charlie, you just kind of see, and it's just like, man, like we called ourselves the 3 Musketeers. Yeah. When things were good. But
it's hard to know how to repair that, isn't it?
Right. Well, once I realized that that's the reason that they didn't want to talk to me, I kind of lost my desire. Like if you can't deal with me if you want me on my best, but like when I'm having trouble getting out of bed because I don't know how I'm going to make it through the next, it doesn't sound like you're the kind of person I want to call. Like what kind of musketeer is that? Yeah. And I think we're losing that, we justify it all the time. So what I wanted to get into this, and I can't seem to find a quote, is a lie is a limiting identity entertained. A lie is a limiting identity entertained. Can I tell you that when I first became a lawyer, the best identity and the most empowering identity that I picked up was a lawyer? Mm-hmm. Can I tell you that 17 years into practice as a lawyer, the most limiting identity that I now have
is a lawyer.
Is a lawyer.
Right.
And it's interesting you talk about what they didn't teach you in law school. Right. I mean, can you believe I was a solo practitioner for 17 years, no paralegal, no assistant, no one answering my phones, no one doing anything, because I had all these problems, this story. And it's only recently that I've now been able to go out from underneath it because no one teaches about becoming an entrepreneur or a businessman.
Right, they don't.
Why are lawyers so disconnected from the concept of business?
That is an excellent question. And some of it comes to risk aversion. Law schools teach us to be risk averse. If you think about your first year in law school, what we did was we took contracts or torts, but every case we read was a business failure that ended up in court, and we were to learn the legal principles from the appellate court that reviewed the original court's decisions. And so we are taught, it's in the water, it may not be in the words, don't take any risks. Right. And this is why lawyers have some places have a reputation as being deal busters, deal breakers, too timid to go forward. But that's all part of our training, and that's a piece of the training we've got to undo and say, look, If the client needs to take risks, your job as a lawyer is to advise them as to what is the potential legal liability in these different degrees of risk that you're willing to take so that they can make the decision based on their values and their goals.
Well, the other thing you said earlier kind of turns that on its ear, like where you said that your malpractice carrier would have a problem if you got money for doing the very same thing that you would do if they were your legal client. And and that like, how much horse crap is that? Like we are so, we're so stuck on this idea of comfort and like lack of risk that we don't actually live or do anything that's freaking helpful sometimes.
Yeah, we are taught, if you've gone through law school, whether or not you're a risk-averse person, you're going to become a risk-averse person. And what your law practice, we would hope, would teach you is that that's not the best way to build an enterprise, that you need to be open to risk. You need to be open to new ideas. I mean, look, our profession is totally closed to new ideas as well. In Europe, they have multidisciplinary practice. I could team up with a CPA. I could team up with a PR specialist, and I could do legal work, get the accounting done, have all the PR available as one team. And our bars won't let us do that. They won't let us have, and it limits the way we capitalize, the way we can raise capital. It limits all kinds of things.
Well, that was the Enron consequence, right? Enron was the one that put the nail in the coffin for that. So it's interesting. We see the very worst possible. We see the very worst possible event, and then that sets the rule for everything.
That sets the rule for everybody. That's right.
Do you think we ought to tell the story about the negotiations class situation?
Charlie, I think you're going to tell that story better than I am. But
I don't know if I even remember it.
I remember it. Well, I remember.
Okay, I think you should tell your side of the story, and then I'll in objection I'll jump in with my.
I will admit I do not remember all the details
I don't remember
of
the
this
details
story.
either.
But Charlie was in my negotiations class in 2006, maybe something like that.
2006, yeah.
And there was and he was either partnered with he was partnered with the negotiations. She was the adversary, so they were partnered together.
Well, no, we were partners, and it was against the other team.
Oh, that's right. You were on the same side. He was partnered with this young woman, and they were against another team that were equally partnered. And I don't remember exactly what happened, but I do remember that you stood up and started yelling at her. And there was a little bit of an outburst in the class, which we were all quite surprised by.
I can't imagine a little bit of an outburst.
A little bit of outburst. And I think most people found it quite entertaining. Personally, I thought it was just hilarious. I thought this is great for this class because we can see how your emotions how the negotiation with your own partner is a negotiation.
She kept cutting my legs out. We're trying, you had broken us up into pairs and we were supposed to negotiate. And I've always struggled with actually trying to play full out with those things because I just don't like it. It's just so made up, and I don't know what it was. And she just was completely doing stuff that just cut my legs out from underneath me that we were talking about. And I just finally,
you let her have it.
But that was a product of my reactivity.
That's
like that was back when I was
very reactive. That is true.
Very much. And so that continued until a couple of years ago, if you can imagine. So, but it really, it was just very impactful, that's for sure. There's two people that might be listening. Mm-hmm. Future lawyers. Yes. What advice do you have on how they can be better lawyers in the 21st century, given the fact that there's such a change and we're not getting some of this information? What do you think they could do aside from joining local bar associations? I think money becomes an issue for that, and it gets tiresome listening to older lawyers talk about all their old war stories.
I agree with that, actually. The best use of us old lawyers is not to tell our old war stories. It's to tell how we fixed the mistakes that we made, what we've learned about being a lawyer, the lawyer identity that you brought up earlier, and how we can be of some service to the new lawyers going forward. The thing I would tell the person thinking about going to law school is there are a couple of things. And I've been shocked that some of my students I've learned haven't even considered what I'm about to say. Number one is, do you understand that the law is an adversarial profession, that it involves conflict, it involves disagreement, and if you're not comfortable with conflict and disagreement, you need to think twice about doing this.
Or think about how to get comfortable doing it.
Or think about how to get comfortable with it. So that is just critical. I had a law student this year, after she's more than $200,000 in debt in law school, say, JB, I don't like this adversarial system. And then I wanted to say, well, I didn't say this, but what the hell you come to a law school for? You know, it's an adversarial system. My image of that is, if you become a doctor and you become a surgeon and you walk into the operating room, every person in that operating room is there to help you achieve your goal to heal, cut that patient in the right place and fix the right thing, sew them up right and get them well, right? The lawyer who walks in the courtroom, the judge is against them, the prosecutor or the other side is against them.
Sometimes your own client.
Sometimes your own client is against you. The jury might be against you. The bailiff may not like you.
This is great. Yes, keep
You're
going.
fighting everybody.
We are really, and we talked about this earlier, because of that, like the whole concept of psychology, you know, like knowing what's going on and how do we actually change them.
Yeah.
What else? What would you say to someone who doesn't know anything about lawyers, isn't thinking about becoming a lawyer, just interested in the fact that we're talking about lawyers? Because for some reason people are interested in, you know, the lives and beings of lawyers, because it's just, you know, we are perceived as being a person in our society that has power and influence, and, you know.
I'm going to say something that's real unpopular these days. Lawyers are critical to a free society.
They are.
You know, there's that famous Shakespeare quote from, it was Henry IV or something, first let's kill all the lawyers.
Right, yep.
The context is, of course, first let's kill all the lawyers if we want to impose dictatorship and domination.
Right.
Because we grease the wheels of democracy so that it can be preserved in our culture. We're absolutely essential. The rule of law, as opposed to the rule of the king or the rule of the Tsar or Genghis Khan, the rule of law depends on a legal system in which lawyers protect the rights of people.
Couldn't say it better myself. I really appreciate the concept of conflict and adversarial. And you said people, you said you had this student that didn't want to go in because it's an adversarial system. There are aspects of our law and places for lawyers that don't really require a lot of conflict, though, aren't there?
There are, yes. Yes, there are.
And what do you also, like, really opened my eyes that there's nothing, quite frankly, there's nothing off the table. I mean, you can't do unethical behavior. But as far as, like, that story that you told me about, even on, because I think I raised my hand and asked who paid for the flowers.
Right.
And and your answer was who?
Yeah, it was me.
Right. And I
I never told that to the client.
And I asked you, did the client know? And I think you said, maybe not.
Maybe not.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
But really what it let me realize, and that, once again, going back to what's the eye on the ball, I think a lot of times lawyers are put in a weird situation, and it's kind of a multiple of these concepts that you're talking about. Fear of new ideas.
Right.
Fear of upsetting the client.
Right.
Fear of conflict.
Right.
And interest in own pocketbook.
Right. And interest in winning and not losing.
Yeah. And but that made it a win. Going outside the box made that a win. Made that a win.
Yeah, that was a
and
huge
quite frankly, how much more money could you have charged if it would have gone to litigation?
I would have made a lot of money. If Charlie didn't give the whole background on this case, but basically, It was a case where I was representing an institution that had fired a young woman, and
It had been there for 30 years, right?
she'd been there a long time, and she thought they'd done her wrong, and it turned out, after I had a really open conversation with her lawyer, this case was about dignity. It wasn't about money, it was about dignity.
Right.
And all her family was coming over for a big dinner on Saturday to her house.
And she got fired.
And she got fired, and she had been shamed. And I said, would it help any if a florist truck arrived at the house just when everybody was gathered and a big bouquet came in that said, thank you for your service?
Right.
You know?
Right.
And it did. We resolved what would, because my client's marching orders, and I'm going to give the exact words, JB, we will pay when the Supreme Court of the United States of America turns down our petition for writ of certiorari. That's when we'll pay. Well, that was a lot of money for me. I could have made a lot of money taking this case to the Supreme Court, but it wouldn't have solved the problem.
Right. That's one thing is like that. That's one thing I think it is missing. The thing that I think it is missing is lawyers truly being able, we call it client control or client management. I'm not sure if that's the best way to put it.
I think that we need better words.
I think so as well. And you also teach client counseling, and I never took that class from you because I heard it was crap.
Well, you were wrong. What you heard was wrong. It's actually the best class I teach.
I have heard that. What I think that and this goes back to that Patrick Lencioni 5 dysfunctions of a team.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about lack of trust, fear of conflict, inability to commit, avoidance of accountability, and inattention to results. Here's the way I think it shows up. At some point in time, someone told us that because you're the lawyer, that you have all the answers, or people ought to respect what you have to say. And it happened to me earlier in a practice, and I don't know how it did. I would have people come in, and I'm embarrassed to say that I said this to people, so please, don't look at me. We're all a work in progress. I remember clients paying me for a consult on whether it's domestic or whether it was criminal, and it would be an hour, and it'd be 55 minutes into it, and I wouldn't have been able to get a word across edgewise.
Right.
And I can remember a couple of times I got frustrated. I said, you're paying me money to talk to me, but you're not listening to anything that I'm having to say. You want to talk the whole time.
Yeah.
And what it did was shut them down. It shamed them, and it's shame, blame, and judgment. And that's the number one way to violate. What that does is it disempowers the client.
Well, it disempowers the client, but Charlie, there's a real problem in any system in which we're trying to help people. You don't have the rest of your life to hear their whole story. You have other things you have to do.
Right.
They have to pay you, so there's got to be a way that we can respect each other's role.
And you had said it so well beforehand that there's one part that they haven't been able to tell.
Right.
Like that's what I noticed, especially with the criminal and the domestic stuff, because everyone around them uses shame words. Shame words are need, should, got to, and have to.
Yeah.
And non-shame words are ought or could. Mm-hmm. And so if you can use non-shame words and talk, but most people are just like, well, you're such an idiot for doing that. Like you clearly only think about yourself. And the problem is all those things built off of assumption create like that. Now that becomes the litigation factor because now the person's mind says, well, I'm not like that. So that's the point of contention as opposed to let's talk about the real facts. But at some point in time, lawyers became convinced that because they were lawyers, that for the sake of being a lawyer, that everyone's going to listen to what they have to say.
Yeah, well, that's crazy.
It is.
They might, and sometimes the lawyers think that.
Right. So what I've now found is if you can create the neurological safety, and then you build time to build the trust, and so that's establish rapport, let the client know that you love them and and actually fucking care about the problem that they have. If you come across as someone who doesn't care about the problem that's the most important problem to them, you will not get buy-in. And once you get that buy-in, then, but it takes healthy conflict to get a client to buy into something that they might not want to do that's extra work for them. And at the same point in time, tell them you can't promise results. Like that's the one thing with criminal, and I'm not sure if...
No, we can't promise results.
Well, the one thing that I know we run into with criminal is because we have to do a bifurcated system. So we have to try guilt or innocence first.
Right.
While at the same point in time be ready for mitigation for sentencing. So it's almost impossible. And I know the criminal
Both
must be,
and.
you have to do both at the same time without losing the client's confidence that
Right.
you're actually trying to win the case. Because they say, well, why am I planning on losing if we're planning on winning?
Yeah.
You know, and it becomes this really difficult situation to handle. Yeah. With just wrapping up the last bit of this, since we've been here for quite some time, and there's people probably want me to stop talking. They'd love to hear more from you. How would you like to leave us on this? Is there anything that you can think of about this that we can kind of wrap up for the viewers? And
what I'm thinking about is that we need to regain the lawyer's identity as helping people in the culture to making this a safe, just, democratic culture. The key practical technique for that in our profession, and I write about this a lot in my book, is if we can get down to find out what the real problem really is. So many of the conflicts that we have in courts, that we have in business, is not about the real problem. And we need to be able to train lawyers to be willing and brave enough to get down to getting to talk about what's really going on here.
I can't agree more.
And that requires some psychological expertise. It requires some trauma sensitivity. It requires all kinds of skills that we're not as well trained as we need to be, because my license says I'm an attorney and counselor at law.
Right.
And I take that seriously. So my parting words are, remember that when you hire a lawyer, you've hired an attorney and counselor at law, and you should expect both of those.
17 years ago, when I passed the bar and started practicing, I used word lawyer because no one seemed to respect counselor. Like, you didn't see it anywhere. You saw attorney or you saw a lawyer. You didn't see anything else. You didn't see counselor at law. And you and I talked earlier today as we were kind of deciding about what to do here, and we were talking about, you personally had been kind of confronted about whether or not you're practicing psychology as a lawyer.
That's
right? And we were kind of kicking around just that lawyers have to be experts in so many different things.
So many things.
If you're going to try, I mean, what kind of things have you had to almost become an expert in order to try to try the case?
The manufacture of bowling alleys.
What else?
Pin spotting machines, beer cans, some boats, some technical computer equipment, how banks, or in the pre-digital days, how banks organize their data, data storage,
Right.
all kinds of things. How to split mica.
Lawyers are masters, could be masters of problem solving, but I think even more so, lawyers are masters of concepts.
Yeah.
And applying those concepts. So, my friend, it's been wonderful seeing you on here. Hopefully we can have you on again.
Thank you so much, Charlie. It's been a delight.
Yeah, thank you for your mentorship throughout the years, whether you realized that you were doing it or not, and I needed it. And, man, I love you so much, and I love the work you've been doing, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this edition of What Are We Not Talking About with J.B. Burtch and Charlie Inch. Please check out his book, Raising the Bar Guidebook.
For the Mentor Guidebook for New Lawyers.
The Mentor Guidebook for New Lawyers. I think that would be good for anybody, even if you're not a lawyer. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you and seeing you on the next episode.